Welcome back to another episode of Science of the Strike. My name is Corbin Healy, and I'm joined with my co-host, Sam Huckabee. This is a podcast that is dedicated to taking a more analytical and scientific approach towards bass fishing. Sam and I are not claiming to be biologists or marine biologists by any means, but who we are is largely driven by reading the science, reading the analytics behind what we do. And Sam and I, as avid bass anglers, want to understand better about not only how to catch more fish, but to understand the fish that we are targeting, which is largemouth bass. So, little shameless plug, we are available. You can find us on Spotify, YouTube, and Instagram. Hopefully, we'll be starting a TikTok page here soon. We always want to encourage our listeners that if you hear this and you think that something is wrong or you disagree really with the studies, because that's what we do. We analyze these scientific studies and bring that information in a more condensed way to you, so we can all understand the sport better. If you disagree with something, please let us know. We've gotten a lot of feedback in our social media comments in the past few days, some really, really great discussions about people who disagree with these studies, and that's awesome. You know, it gets a conversation going, so feel free to reach out to us. Also, if you have a topic that you want to hear about, we've had probably 20 people reach out to us with different things that they want to hear about. We've got a long queue of upcoming episodes, so if you want to get in that, please feel free to reach out. So, as you probably saw on the title of this video, today we are talking about a really, really big topic. We're going to do our best to condense it down in about an hour or less for you. And that's memory, or a bass's ability to learn. I think that, you know, the anecdotal phrase is that, you know, fish have a memory. A goldfish has a memory of 3 seconds, and then it forgets. And the science clearly goes against that in so many different ways. We're going to kind of almost break down memory in a way into a multitude of episodes, but Sam's going to kick us off with starting about a study about the brain composition of largemouth bass. I'll be sure to throw in some pictures of you for you during Sam's bit here. I also want to remind the listener that before we get going, Sam and I don't converse about these topics until right now. So he is teaching me and I am teaching him, so our reactions are legitimate and we have no idea what the other person really is studying. So Sam's going to start us off with brain composition, and then also is going to get into a little bit of some stuff on location.
All right, guys, let's do this. So our first article that I'm going to bring us today was actually just done in 2024 out of a couple of universities in China. And I just want to make a quick note. Largemouth bass in China is just as much of a game fish as it is here, but it's also a very highly studied fish over there for like production of meat and for fish for people to eat over there. So this article is coming out of a couple of universities. They went together to do this study over the specific biomarkers and neuron distribution of different brain regions in a largemouth bass. So they basically went through a couple fish. I think it was like 6 fish, took the brains out of them, and really, really dove into evaluating the certain areas of these brains, different gene expressions, looking at your, transcriptome studies, tons of different analysis of this. So that's kind of like the background of where I'm getting my first study from. So to jump into it, there's 4 main parts of a bass brain: a telencephalon, diencephalon, mesencephalon, and rhombencephalon. Okay. There's more in a human brain. Okay. Just for that. Okay. It's not as simple as that. There's 4 main regions. Okay. There's also other little parts that come along with it, but those 4 main regions contain most everything, that's going on in a bass. Okay. So, they identified 74 nuclei that they further sent through morphological and cytoarchitectonic analysis. Okay, so very in-depth studies of these cells, these nuclei that basically break down and send a lot of the brain waves back and forth and allow for the bass to, have, emotion, or, see, or, smell, or all these different things that go in through the brain, to
Sure.
allow them to evaluate these things.
Sure.
So I want to also start off with this. They made it very, very clear that in this current study and in previous studies, that oxidative phosphorylation related genes were the most highly expressed in the whole brain of the largemouth bass. And what these genes do is they are highly related to energy consumption.
Okay.
So that means the bass's brain is working on overload more than any other area in the body related to energy consumption. Okay. So that just tells you right away that bass's brain is constantly working to figure things out, whether that's seeing, memory, all these different things that we're going to talk about,
Sure.
but that is very important to know that bass's brain is its highest energy consumption.
Wow.
So that's
Wow.
super important statistical, evidence, to point to something like we're going to try to talk about today as memory.
Right. They're thinking.
So
they're processing what's happening.
Yes,
They're
there's
not
a
just
lot going on in that brain.
lot
Right.
going on. Okay.
Which is important to, have that baseline to start.
Yep.
So they did a transcriptome analysis and revealed a total of 7,151 region highly expressed genes in the bass's brain. Okay, and 176 region specifically expressed genes. So these are genes related to growth, reproduction, emotion, learning, memory. All of those I just listed are all overexpressed in the olfactory bulb and telencephalon. Okay, so that's where we're going to spend most of our time today, in that area of the brain. Okay, but I want to make note that like feeding and stress related genes, those were found in the hypothalamus. Vision, hearing related genes, those were expressed in the cerebellum areas of the brain. Sensory input, motor output related genes, those are in the medulla oblongata. So there's a lot going on in this bass's brain. Okay, it's not as simple as I'm swimming around, I see food, I'm eating food, I'm staying in this area because I like this area. Okay,
I love how technical we're getting with this. Like, this is what nobody dives into. This, I mean, this is awesome.
And that's the fun part of it. I mean, this study just came out last year. Probably not a lot of people have read this study over the bass's brain in this kind of detail. This study is the most in-depth study that has ever been done on a bass's brain. And I can firmly state that. From all the research I've done on this in the past few days, this is the study to be looking at right now.
Awesome.
So there's also osmoregulation, stress response, sleep, and awake cycles, but all of those are expressed in the remaining brain. They did not specify where these come from. I think they had a hard time, relating those genes, but they did find those genes in the brain, right? So, in mammalian brains, or human brains of that nature, there is a layered pallium, is what they call it. It is what is a feature of the brain that is part of the cerebral cortex that allows for distinct layers of neurons to be organized and perform functions like sensory motor control, higher cognitive activities, learning, and memory. Okay, so this is one of the main differences why in the past people have not contributed memory or learning to largemouth bass, because they have always believed in the 3-second rule. Right, as Corbin kind of stated in our entry. And that's because they do not have this structure in their brain like we do. Okay, so they have the 4 main distinct regions that make up, and over evolutionary time, have learned or grown, adapted to being able to do these certain sorts of things. Okay. So that's a super important distinction to make from why in the past, they may have been thought to not be able to, have any kind of learned responses or memory or that type of thing, right?
Sure.
So, and I want to make note of this, they have found that same thing for carp, sea bass, and tilapia. And those 3 fish are some of the most studied fish, of, teleost fish that you can find on the internet, right? So that's important to note, that it's very similar to all of those studies as well.
Right.
So let's get to the important part. Telencephalon. Okay, there's 16 nuclei that they identified, and within that nucleus, that's the DM, DI, VV, and DC nucleuses. Were the main 4 that they mentioned. Okay, these nucleus in fish have been reported as functional homologs to the mammalian amygdala, hippocampus, and lateral septum regions, where in those same regions in the human brain are involved in regulating anxiety and depression. Okay. Also, in that nucleus, the DC nucleus that they found in the gymnotiform fish that they've studied in the past has been reported to participate in learning and memory. Okay. So right off the bat from that research study and the past studies of that gymnotiform fish, they have shown that learning and memory can happen from that gene, that nucleus in there, that it gives them the ability to be able to do that.
Okay, so let me make sure I'm understanding this in layman's terms, or dumb this down for me. Is essentially that this study is revealing that that certain distinguishable markers in the neurons or the nuclei of a bass's brain indicates that it might or is capable of learning certain behavior, and that's based off of studies that have been confirmed with other fish who have the same or similar nucleus structure or neuron structure, that do indeed have memory or have the capacity to learn skills or traits. Is that fair?
Yes, that's exactly
okay.
Right. So that is probably one of the most important statistics from this study, that they were able to mark that, have a marker, mark that nuclei, realize it's the same thing that comes from other teleos fish that they have studied and found some learned abilities or memory, from those other fish. So with that being said, those translate the same way across teleos fish. In theory, the bass should be able to have some sort of memory or learning ability. So
biologically, biologically
by the makeup of his brain,
of their brain.
Their brain.
That's great to hear.
So that's huge. That debunks a lot of old myths of them not being able to do that. With those abilities, you would think they should be able to do that.
Sure.
Okay. So additionally, neurotransmitter receptors associated with emotion, learning, memory, such as the serotonin receptors and adrenergic receptors, were highly expressed in this same area in the telencephalon. Okay. And the Abdullah. Okay. So there's multiple things that are playing into this, especially, serotonin receptors and adrenergic receptors are more related to emotion, but emotion can tie into, learning and memory.
Sure.
Like serotonin levels fluctuate, that's depression and things of that nature, that affects that. So with that being said, if you're saying a bass can have that kind of emotion, that emotion can tie into the learning and memory in many ways. So
yeah, that would be interesting to get into, because I think that could be its own episode. I struggle to believe that, while I do feel like I give a lot of credit to largemouth bass, way more, I think people don't give enough credit to the fish. I struggle to get over the hurdle of saying that they have emotion. I don't
or
know
feeling,
if I'm or feel. I mean, like, they can feel pain, right? But like not
sadness.
Not sadness. I'm not. I don't. And it doesn't seem like that. This study is defining that that's what's going on necessarily.
Not at all. They're just saying that they have been linked, to those types of things. Just a serotonin
in other
receptor,
animals,
adrenergic receptors in other animals.
But
they are highly expressed in these same areas.
Oh, interesting.
So that points to a possibility, right? Or
something
along those lines. So this is a crazy study. I'm telling you, they really dug into, what markers are in the brain, and if markers overlap, and species. So that's very
it's
very
not
cool.
dispositive of whether or not they can or cannot feel emotion, but you're saying biologically they have similar physical traits that resemble those of animals who can feel emotion.
Yeah. Now, whether they're producing, as much serotonin when something happens, and the adrenergic receptors are firing, at the same level we are in humans, is probably not. Okay.
Sure.
But they are, they have the potential to do that type of stuff. So I will say, and I'll finish off with that study here real quick, that I just want to mention, going back to our episode 1 with the vision, I wanted to note that the study demonstrates a well-developed visual system in the largemouth bass, evidence from the enlarged size of their optic tectum structure and high neural activity. So it just goes to point, back to our episode 1, where the visual system is just unreal in a largemouth bass. What they can see, colors they can see, those types of things. This study also confirms, what we were kind of learning about in that study, that their visual system is, one of their most important parts of their brain.
Sure.
Okay. This next study I want to talk about real quick is called Site Fidelity and Seasonal Habitat Preferences of Largemouth Bass. They did this in 2015 through 2017. Let me look real fast. It was can't quite remember exactly who wrote it, but it was done in Ontario. Okay. So it's a northern study, and it says right here, biotactic fisheries research and monitoring. They also did the Department of Biology, University of Toronto. So another, well-known research facility, Toronto, very big school, University of Toronto, Department of Biology. So very, very well done study from what I could find, and what they did with, and like how they track these fish and everything. So let me get back here. Okay. So site fidelity is the first, question I had. Like, what does that mean? And that's super important to know for this study. It's the biological concept describing an animal's tendency to return to a previously visited location.
Right.
Okay. Right. So that's what this whole study looked at, is tracking these fish over time and seeing, what they did, and, how they got back to these areas, what areas did they go to, that type of stuff. So super, super interesting study. You could have a whole podcast on something like this, a whole episode on this called, movement or seasonal patterns, or however you want to do it. But I'm sure we will. I think this ties in very well to their ability to have memory. Okay. Just because of fish movement. And you can gather a lot of that from this study. Okay. So just a few things to note before we dive into the study. They did it on Lake Eugenia in Ontario, where the average depth is 5 foot. Okay. So pretty shallow, but its deepest does get around 40 foot. Okay. So it's got some deeper holes. The average of the lake is fairly shallow. Right. Another thing to take note is they draw down this lake. So this is a man-made lake where they have a dam on it and they control the water on it. And that was one of the main reasons why they chose this lake, because other studies have been done on non-human controlled lakes, because they wanted to evaluate how the fish move when they move the water, when they draw it down, and things like that, how human interaction affects it. So they're using that to try to drive the study a little bit. Okay. So very, very interesting, right? It's all about, how, they can affect the movement in this study, and they're trying to push movement, and winter, spring, fall, summer are all, the seasons that they're really trying to focus on where they're going during these times. And from previous knowledge, they know, and previous studies, that, fish in the winter are going to go to a little deeper area. They might pack up a little more. Summer, similar. Fall, they're going to be more moving around. Spring, they're going to be more moving around, but in those shallower areas. None of that changed from this study. They found all of that to be very similar. Okay. They did find, like how tight fish pack together to be a little bit tighter than they thought, in the winter, and how some wintering holes are used way more often than others over years. So they did this over 2 years. Right. Okay. It was a very well done study. And, most studies can't have the funding to last this long, let alone track fish for that long. Sure. So it was done really well. So they took 49 samples. I think they used 30 fish. The most important fish are 3 of them, though. 3 fish were caught and relocated. Okay. So that is the important fish that I'm going to talk about today, with how those fish kind of reacted to that nature. The other fish were caught, released in the same area with a tracker embedded in them. These fish were caught, taken miles away and then dropped in the water again. Okay. So, like I said, this is a man-made reservoir regulated by humans. Okay, super important. Where they're challenging the fish navigation and homing abilities is what it kind of came down to in their previously selected habitats.
Sure.
So with the extreme water fluctuations, it's important to note that freezing happens on this lake. They're in Ontario, Canada. Okay,
Sure.
so
Yeah.
they made sure to mention that a lot of these fish were tracked from driving a truck on the ice and getting the monitor to match up with them in the areas.
Whoa. Okay.
Because when they couldn't drive the boat out there, that's how they had to gather their information, is get close enough with a little GPS beacon that pinged, okay, the fish is in this area, right?
Wow.
So I'll start with the general just results that they got from differing seasons of how these fish returned to their original holes that they started in. So they did it within 200 meters and 400 meters of within that same area. So that's, not that large of a space. 200 meters, is a couple football fields, that's the way, I kind of thought of it, So it's really a pretty small area. So for fish in the fall, they found that they were the worst about going back to their certain areas. Okay. So 29% returned within 400 meters, 21% returned within 200 meters. Okay. So only about a fifth of the fish returned to where they were the previous fall. Okay. When they were doing that. They did find that 33% in the spring for 200 meters and 58% for 400 meters. So even more likely to return in the spring. And then they found that 23% in the summer and 59% in the summer for 200 and 400 meter, proximity of where they return.
Sure.
But then winter was 44% within 200 meters and 89% within 400 meters.
That is wild.
So that's some pretty crazy statistics right there to show you like how well they move back to their areas in the winter.
Wow.
And it said that most of the time they were only habitating, I think it was 3 to 4 meters for the winter, which is not like they're going to 40 foot deep, the deepest part of the lake. They're all just going to sit in that same spot. Right. That's initially what my thoughts were, but I made that check and it was like, 3 to 4 feet is, the general area that they spent most of their time in, and not 3 to 4 feet, 3 to 4 meters. Right. So 12 to 20 feet, in that range, which is realistic, if that ice to freeze, on the top, layers a foot or so, and then they can sit underneath there. So, okay. The interesting part when these fish that were caught, right, and taken miles away, how they returned. Okay. So this study did a really, really good job about mapping out the structure underneath the lake to cancel out their ability to use like a tree, or a grass line, to return back to an area. Okay.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Okay.
So they tried to put them in areas that did not have a lot of ground structure to see features,
of lake features,
how they would move back to the areas. Right. Okay. And they made sure to mention, fish spent so much amount of time around the grass, that they found in this lake. That was, the biggest ground structure feature in the lake that they spent most of their time around. And, there were some laid down logs, but not very many of that, not very much of that at all. Okay. So, fish 1 and fish 2 were relocated, 4 days after their release. Okay. And they were released and they were found 1.78 kilometers away from their release point, 1.78 and 2.6 kilometers. Okay. So that's over a mile away from where they released them. They took them and then released them. And from where they released them, they were over a mile away from where they released them. Okay.
I got it.
So, and from that release, from where they were found at that point, they were only 650 meters and 210 meters away from their initial catch point.
Wow. So they came back.
They basically came back to their homing site.
And not only did they come back, but they came back on a journey that was intentionally made to be featureless or to have as few features to help aid them in their journey back.
Right, right. And with
Wow.
the mass majority of the lake being, 5 foot, you can kind of assume that, it's not super the depth that's really guiding that too much, But also, I'm not taking away the bass's features of ability to, hear, sense the oxygenation, other things of that nature.
That's the whole thing, I think, Sam, though. I mean,
Right,
I think that's the
right.
whole point.
And that's how they can make it back. But it's ability to, potentially learn and remember, areas that they were in, that can potentially put them back in those areas.
Uh-huh.
They learn,
Uh-huh.
what they, what's the right place for them, where they can find to hide and live and eat, in certain areas. And to go in 4 days back to that area, I think speaks to some ability to have that kind of memory or learning ability to know where to go back to, right?
Sure.
I'm not necessarily saying they remember that exact spot, because they didn't go back to the exact spot,
Right.
but they were within the same area of the lake, that they got taken out of, which I think
Yes.
speaks to some ability to cognitively remember, features that take them to that area,
Right.
that
Right.
affect them wanting to be in that area.
Yes.
Okay.
100%.
So that was the most important thing. They found the third fish 1.79 kilometers away from its release point 12 days later, and they found it 650 meters from its release point too.
Okay.
So all these fish worked their way back to to a surrounding close area,
Right.
way closer than where they were let go.
Right.
So that's important. That's super impactful information for how bass function and move, right? And allow for memory possibility, of that sort of, how they live their life in those types of situations.
Yes.
So, let's talk about this a little bit. So, they made sure to mention that translocated fish, which is what I'm talking about here, move quickly back to overwintering bay areas. Okay,
right.
Likely
That was
through an
89%.
entrained process triggered in responses to a fixed suite of environmental cues such as flow, temperature, dissolved oxygen, which are important in bass overwintering times. So they calculated it to be part of those couple cues, flow, temperature, and oxygen, that allowed them to work their way back to that area. But, that also points to the fact that they remember, or can, potentially feel, some of those flows and remember where they potentially were from that area too. So I just think this points to a lot of super impactful stuff, like bass really
Right.
care about those things, and memory, can play into this some. So,
Yeah.
And lastly here, I want to talk about this. They said, to finish off their study, the return of largemouth bass to specific seasonal habitats was not impeded by littoral disturbances. So they're saying by humans drawing up and down the lake from catches, people catching them, and other things of that nature within this study. And thus fish have either committed home range features to memory or mechanistic navigation cues, olfaction, vision, electrolocation, audition, water movement, and things of that nature to be able to return home. So
Wow.
I just found that super, super interesting.
There it is.
That they potentially have that ability, and likely do, from the brain studies that we looked at, and just from a few little movement study. So
Sure.
I just think that's mind blowing. That's
super, super interesting. And it's again, the studies aren't saying that the bass has a map, drawn on its fin that it knows how to, but something in the brain composition and in the neurons, in the neurological makeup of the bass show us that they are capable of using all of their senses in conjunction to navigate back to places time and time and time again from far distances over long periods of time.
Yeah.
That's wild.
Really
It's
cool
impressive.
stuff. Really cool
It's
stuff.
impressive. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Is that all that you got?
Yeah, that's what I got. So
Okay.
let's know what you got.
So I'm going to tell you about some pretty interesting studies here. I'm going to try to be as efficient as possible because there's actually 4 that I want to mention real quick. The first study will blow your mind and just goes to confirm what we're just talking about with memory and this Telos fish, or if that's even how you pronounce it, Telos fish.
Yeah.
So this study was conducted in 2008, and it's called Long-Term Memory in Fish by this guy named Stephen Reeves. I'm just going to get right to the point and talk about different fish and the results of what they found in the capacity for memory in different fish. All right. So goldfish have been shown to recall memories from maze experiments for at least 1 month, and in some cases up to 6 months. One study even noted that goldfish immediately selecting the correct colored tubes for food a year after no reinforcement. What? Okay. Catfish trained to respond to a specific call, and I actually read this this guy who did this study. His specific call is that he would approach the lake with catfish food in his hand, and he would just say, "Come here, fish." That's all, with his voice. "Come here, fish." Catfish trained to respond to a specific call were observed to do so after a 5-year lapse without any reinforcement. Carp that had previously been hooked exhibited what's called hook shyness a year later, despite no intervening encounters with hooks. Rainbow trout remembered how to press a bar for food reward after a 3-month break, even when hand-fed during that period.
No,
However,
that's interesting.
Yeah. However, it's important to note that another study on rainbow trout found that they forgot a specific food item after 3 months, which suggests that memory duration can be context dependent, which I'm going to get into later.
I'm sure.
Crimson spotted rainbow fish retain the ability to escape a maze apparatus after 11 months. And finally, salmon display what you just said, that remarkable long-term memory imprinting, remembering the unique smell of their natal stream for several years that guide them back for their spawning. So there's no question that fish have the capacity to learn certain behavior, or at least to associate different responses with certain triggers. And I think if you want more evidence than what we're going to read to you tonight, go listen to episode 1 on vision. Go listen to the episodes on scent. I mean, truly, they are training bass to go towards colored cue cards to receive food. I mean, it's miraculous how these fish are capable of being taught and trained. The next thing that I want to talk about is actually an article, so less official than what we usually use. We usually talk about big papers or dissertations or these big biological studies that are published. This is actually just an interview that Wired to Fish published back in May of this year. May 13th, 2025, they did an interview with a guy named Mark Sexton, who is the director of fish science and product testing for Pure Fishing in Berkeley Fishing. So he gave some quotes in this article that, while not supported directly by data in this article, I'm assuming he's basing this off of his long-term experience. He said that there is evidence that bass are very familiar with the places where they choose to live. They know where every brush pile is, every big rock, where every channel is. That's their home, and that's where they feel comfortable. They learn different things to make their lives easier. For example, in the spring, a big female bass might learn that eating something big gives her more energy than feeding on 100 small minnows. Sexton says that he is 100% sure that bass can learn. He goes on to say that through our research, we found that bass can remember for up to 3 months and possibly longer. In one study in Berkeley labs, that notion was tested. Bass in a large tank were studied for their reaction to a hard bait that was dragged past them. First time, this is him, direct quote from Mark Sexton. The first time, every one of those bass hit the tar out of that bait. We waited a couple of days and did the same thing, and only a few of them would hit. We repeated that procedure multiple times, and after 3 months, they wouldn't touch the crankbait.
No way.
That confirmed what many pro bass anglers have experienced in the wild, especially in lakes where bass are exposed to heavy fishing pressure. It doesn't take them long to figure out the game.
Holy.
Right. I mean, like, I'm not reading you a study, but I'm reading you words from someone who does this for a living, right? So that's pretty
Or
interesting.
something, yeah.
And we're going to do a whole, for the listener, Sam and I have queued up, we're going to do a whole nother episode on pressure. It is actually crazy, the science behind angler pressure impact on largemouth bass over time. Insane, but we're going to save that for a future episode.
That's why I love Canada so much.
Exactly. All right. The next, I guess the first second, I guess, real study is titled Quick Learning, Quick Capture. Largemouth bass that rapidly learn an association task are more likely to be captured by recreational anglers. And this was published by the Behavioral Ecology and Sociobiology study in 2019 by Michael J. Lewison. So this article, this study, explores the connection between a bass's learning ability, behavioral traits, and the likelihood of that fish being caught by a recreational angler. Okay? So there are a few key concepts that we need to understand with this study for it makes sense. Okay, so and kind of like language here. So first is what's called a cognitive syndrome. All right. And they classify a cognitive syndrome. It's a framework that suggests that individuals or fish show consistent differences in their approach to tasks, to executing tasks, like very novel tasks.
Okay.
And they're often categorized as either a fast or a slow learner. Okay. So to be a fast learner, the fish is given a novel task. Approach this color, you get a piece of food, right?
Okay.
And if the fish goes to it immediately, that's considered a fast learner. If the fish goes to it slower, that's considered a slow learner, okay?
Okay, gotcha.
The next is considered a behavioral syndrome, or which is kind of synonymous to what has also been called a coping style. And this refers to consistent individual differences in behavioral responses to the environment. Okay, so in this context, they call them like proactive and reactive, right? So a proactive individual is going to be bold and aggressive in the task or in how it's behaving, and a reactive individual is obviously going to be shyer and more passive, okay? And these styles can be linked actually to other like life history traits like growth throughout their life, and which can kind of make a difference in those proactive or reactive behavioral syndromes. So let's talk about the actual confines of the study, all right? The researchers conducted a multi-stage experiment with 60 largemouth bass, each of which were uniquely identifiable. Essentially, they put tags on every single bass, okay? And they conducted 3 tests on them. Super interesting, okay? The first is what they called their active avoidance test. So this was like in a lab, all right?
Okay.
Fish were trained to associate a light, an overhead light, okay, which they called a conditioned stimulus, with being chased by a net. So someone had a little hand dipper net and would chase them around in the water, and they would associate that net with the light with the net, okay?
Gotcha.
And what they had to do to like succeed in this novel task is that they had to pass through an opening to a safe area to avoid that chasing. Once they passed through the area, the net chasing would stop. Okay, and the performance was measured by metrics like the total success and trials until success that they were able to pass through that. Okay. And this was kind of assessed or this test was used to assess their learning performance, the ability to learn. Okay. Next was the restraint test. I didn't get a lot out of this part, and I still don't feel like there's a whole lot out of this restraint test. I mean, but I'll tell you about it anyways. Fish were held out of the water in a container for 3 minutes, and they recorded their jumping behavior. Okay? Like they're thrashing out of water. Okay, they recorded their
Okay.
total jumps, their time until first jump, time until last jump, and that was kind of recorded as a proxy for that proactivity of that behavioral
I
syndrome,
see. I
right?
see.
Okay. And finally, the third trial, which I think is the most interesting one. All fish, all 60 fish, were released into a naturalistic man-made pond, okay,
Yeah.
and were subjected to very confined recreational angling over the course of 10 days. They knew everyone who came in. They had all of the anglers do similar or same casts around different or the exact same spots around the pond, and they used 3 lures. They used a rooster tail and they used 2 Senkos. Okay, they used one that was white and one that was, I think, like a green one. And the capture status of each of these fish was recorded. All right. And then there was, they called it a principal component analysis and a binary logistical regression that was used to determine the relationships of all these scores, but I'll dumb it down a little bit, okay? The researchers found, this is so interesting, the researchers found that largemouth bass that were considered fast learners in an active avoidance test, the net chasing test,
Yeah.
were more susceptible to being captured by anglers. And this suggests that a fast cognitive strategy, while advantageous in some contexts, might be a disadvantage
To being
for
caught.
fish in environments with human predatory risks like fishing. Okay, so you have to ask yourself,
Yeah.
you're like, this is counterintuitive, right?
Yeah. So the most aggressive bass are the ones that are getting
Right.
them
So
into the stick.
kind of the conclusion of it is that the fast cognitive strategy can be maladaptive for fish populations under angling pressure. While it seems counterintuitive that better learners are more easily caught, this aligns with the cognitive syndrome framework that fast individuals are prone to mistakes. And striking a fishing lure could be considered a major error for them as they tend to approach novel stimuli quickly without thorough inspection. To me, right? Like, that is so interesting and like so cool to read about. So, like,
That just makes me think about like those fish being caught, probably have less of a lifespan,
Oh,
just from
for
fish
sure.
handling and
For sure.
you know,
And what's
dying from being caught, and that leads you to what's left. The fish that
Right.
don't want to bite, the fish that are like slow learners, as
Well-
you're saying, is like that's crazy to just. That's the first thing that comes to my mind.
to me though, that sometimes makes sense, like when you think about like the real giants being so weary, right? Like when you think
Yeah.
about like Butch Brown, when you think about Mike Gilbert, when you think about Oliver Knight, when you think about these guys who are just going full on trophy hunters, they are the most concerned with the sound of their boat, with the sound of them moving around in their boat, the smell of their lure. I mean, because they have to get those big weary fish that might be move slower but might be smarter to strike, right? The fish that move slower are the ones that are capable of maybe being able to discern something from being real or not,
Yeah.
It's really interesting. I'll throw some photos in of kind of there are a bunch of tables that show all of these success numbers and failure numbers and, everything like that. Graphs and charts and all that stuff.
Yeah.
So that's one piece of the puzzle. All right, so moving on. The next study is called hold on, I'm gonna make sure. This is actually the last study that I have. Is that right? Yeah. Okay, so this is the last thing that I have. So this study is, again, super interesting, and it is titled Avoidance Learning and Memory in Largemouth Bass Fed Buffo Tadpoles. Okay. This was conducted by Randy John Gaulick for his master's thesis at the Eastern Illinois University. Now, this is an older study. This is from 1984. Okay, so take it with however you want, right? So this research paper, which was his master's thesis, investigated the avoidance learning and memory in largemouth bass when fed tadpoles. Okay. So, and the study aimed to determine how long a bass could retain this learned avoidance, and explores factors influencing their feeding behavior towards two types of tadpoles. Okay, so one is this Hyla crucifer, which is the type of tadpole, and one is this Buffo americanus. Okay, so I'm just going to call it Hyla and Buffo. Okay, Hyla is considered a palatable tadpole. Okay, so they can eat it. It doesn't taste bad to them, and bass like to eat them. Okay, and then you have this Buffo tadpole, which is considered an unpalatable tadpole. All right.
Okay.
20 largemouth bass were divided into 4 treatment groups with 5 bass per treatment. And the experiment involved feeding, or 3 feeding phases. They did this so well, to assess the effect of hunger level, of the tadpole species, and tadpole size on bass feeding behaviors, as well as, and in our case, more importantly, short-term and long-term memory of learned avoidance. So in other words, can bass have a negative experience and then in turn use that negative experience to say, hey, I'm not going to do that again? That's really what we're getting at. Okay?
Right.
Phase 1, hunger test. All bass were starved for 48 hours and then were offered single tadpoles, either Buffo tadpoles or Hyla tadpoles, in small or large sizes at 10 to 12-minute intervals over 6 to 11 days. And they recorded how frequently they ate the palatable versus the unpalatable tadpoles. Okay. Phase 2 is what they call the satiation test, essentially when the bass were full. So immediately following phase 1, bass were fed crayfish until satisfied, 1 hour before being offered tadpoles for 3 to 5 days. Same thing. So they would give the bass as much crawfish as they could eat, as much as they would want, and then they would release the tadpoles and see what that did. Okay. And then finally was phase 3, the one that matters to us, the memory test. After a 30-day non-tadpole feeding period, all bass were fed crayfish until full, and then offered only the unpalatable tadpoles, the Buffo tadpoles, for 5 days. Okay? This phase specifically tested the retention of this learned avoidance. Okay? The palatability and rejection finding. Okay, this is where we're at. Largemouth bass significantly rejected more Buffo tadpoles and Buffo larvae overall compared to Hyla tadpoles. Okay, so and this is in that first part of this test. Okay, so what this tells us is that they are capable. This goes to our taste and scent episode, right? They are capable of discerning and saying, this tastes good, this does not taste good, I want to eat this, I don't want to eat this. Okay, go listen to episode 2. I mean, we need to pay way more attention to scent, because bass are tasting and smelling these live creatures and are saying, nope, I don't want it. Okay?
Yeah.
When bass were hungry in phase 1, they generally consumed all of the tadpoles, regardless of size or species. But when satiated, bass avoided the unpalatable tadpoles, but regularly consumed the palatable ones. Okay. This is what matters most to us, is this next part. This is that learning and long-term memory finding. Bass that had previously been fed the unpalatable tadpoles and learned to avoid them in phase 2 retained this learned avoidance when offered the unpalatable tadpoles 30 days later. Bass previously fed the palatable tadpole also retained a preference for palatable tadpoles, and they almost exclusively avoided the unpalatable tadpoles in phase 3. Okay, so this suggests that bass can discriminate between palatable brown Hyla tadpoles and unpalatable black Buffo tadpoles, and retain this association over a long period of time.
Yeah, that's interesting. That just goes to show you,
right?
Like, you catch a fish, with a whatever, and it can potentially remember, shape or sound of that bait or whatever you catch it, and you got a month.
I mean, that's 30. I mean, I think the listener is going to want to ask, like, well, how long can bass remember? And this is kind of the last part of these studies, of this study that is so interesting. So obviously, this study suggests that bass can form long-term memories regarding food preferences for at least 30 days. Okay.
Yeah.
But what it says is that while bass can learn to avoid, this is, hold on, I've got this pulled up in a different document. This is not the same. I want to make sure that I'm getting the right source. I want to associate the right source.
I feel like, so much of this is like, classical conditioning, like Pavlov's dogs, you ring a bell, the dog salivates, type of thing. But I think that also, points to that learning ability, like they can remember that, like they can remember, oh, that bell means, food,
Sure.
or something along those lines.
Sure.
You show them a nasty bait, a nasty gold tadpole for so long, and they're not going to want to eat it. And they see that 30 days later, they have that ability to remember. I think that's so interesting, just pointing to, oh, that also makes me think, we put so much on scent, we did that scent episode.
Oh my God.
Like,
yeah,
you're putting that same scent on all of your baits. How long does it take? You ain't going to catch every fish in the lake, obviously. But that's still going to work. But how many times are you fishing in those same areas you had pre-fished, and maybe caught a few fish, and they're like, I remember that scent. Obviously they're trying to make the scent, the amino acids that are the bait flavored and everything. But your hands touching all those baits and stuff like that, like I think they could potentially remember that.
Well, see, I completely agree. But what I would say is kind of the inverse of what you're saying, which I think it's more likely that bass would remember the scent or the smell of something that does not have an additional scent on it. So, for example, a bass might be able to recognize or remember the smell or taste of a plain trickworm,
or something,
right?
Yeah, exactly.
Versus something that has a masking,
some kind of natural scent to it.
Right.
No, that's a good way of looking at it too. Yeah.
So,
for sure.
The what I'm about to read comes from a study that was done in Mississippi, titled "Largemouth Bass Learn to Avoid Capture in." I already said in Mississippi. What it says is that while bass can learn to avoid specific lures or their colors, research suggests that the term angler avoidance may be more accurate to describe their learned wariness. This indicates a broader generalization of their negative experiences. Bass may associate the adverse effects of capture with wider environmental cues, such as the sound of a trolling motor or the visual presence of an angler, rather than solely the specific lure type that led to their capture. This observation is significant because it suggests that bass are not simply memorizing the visual pattern of a particular bait. Instead, they appear to be learning to associate the entire fishing scenario, including boat noise, human presence, and specific retrieve patterns with a negative outcome. So what the biggest takeaway that I want for anybody who's listening is this. As it relates to bass memory, this is shown in the studies that Sam talked about with brain composition and their ability to remember location, and it's also shown in all these studies on long-term memory and avoidance studies that I talked about. The memory element of a largemouth bass is not pinpoint down to just, I remember that lure, or I remember that sound, or I remember what that looked like. It is truly a full picture. It's a holistic approach to remembering a certain scenario. So when you approach a situation, not only do you want to think, hey, what lure maybe can I use to be different? What casting angle can I do to be different? How can I maybe make a longer cast to make sure that fish doesn't hear my trolling motor? How can I be sure that I'm not slamming latches on the deck of my boat? How can I make sure that when I'm sight fishing or on a bed fish that my shirt isn't bright orange and showing off something that they can see and instead maybe matches the background of the sky. It truly shows us that as anglers, to be better fishermen, that you need to take this holistic approach. Sight, sound, scent, everything plays into a bass's memory, which is unbelievable. It's unbelievable.
You got to give the bass credit.
You do. And I honestly, it does not surprise me that you have the trophy anglers that you do coming out time and time and time again saying people are not giving these fish enough credit. They just aren't. And the science that brain scan that you talked about shows it. I mean, it is insane.
It's crazy stuff.
Bass are 100% capable of forming memories, especially those that lead to negative results on them.
Impacts. Yeah.
Negative impacts. Bass remember that.
They're conditioned in that way.
They're conditioned. 100%. 100%. And like I alluded to, we're going to do a study on how literally being caught is changing the genetics of fish over time. Not just their behavior, their genetics, heritable traits that they are having, spawn after spawn after spawn, are showing that these fish are evolving to human pressure and being caught. It is undeniable science that we're going to do a separate episode on. So
definitely.
Big takeaway, bass have memory. Approach the water with a holistic approach, and give these fish the credit that they deserve.
I bet you could, ask some of our listeners, to come in the comments here, if you're an older fisherman, back in the day, was fishing easier? Just as simple as question as that. And I bet most of them would say, yeah, fishing has gotten harder, even with all the equipment that you have now. Sure, it's made some areas of fishing easier, but just fishing in general, I think has gotten harder over time. Pressure, all these things, learned memory from bass, all of the evolution of them selecting certain characteristics to not be caught. And man, just a lot of stuff going on. We had a lot to unpack here and coming up, but this memory is a super, super impactful part for fishing. So yeah.
Well, that's a wrap on episode 7. Thanks again for listening. If you have any questions for Sam and I about wanting to get maybe more specific with these sources or anything like that, please feel free to reach out on YouTube, Spotify, or Instagram at Science of the Strike. Thanks for listening, and we'll catch you on the next one.
See ya.